My son-in-law sent handmade cookies, and everyone said it was sweet. I remember thinking, kindness doesn't usually arrive with this much silence. The box came just before New Year's Eve, wrapped in simple paper that looked almost too careful, like someone had rehearsed folding every edge. I stood in my kitchen, turning it over slowly in my hands, feeling the weight of it before I ever lifted the lid. The house was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that usually comforts me. But something about that package made the air feel thinner. Caleb had been calling more often lately, not to ask how I was doing, not really. His words always curved back to the same place. Timelines, planning, being prepared for the future. A few days earlier, he had mentioned the estate again, lightly, as if he were talking about weather. I gave him the same answer I always did. Not yet. I didn't raise my voice. I never needed to. When I opened the box, the smell of sugar and butter filled the room, warm and familiar. Anyone else would have seen it as a gesture of peace. I arranged the cookies on a small plate and told myself I was being too sensitive. Families go through seasons. That was all. I had barely poured my tea when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Fast, careless, young. Orion's laugh reached the porch before he even knocked. My grandson never arrived quietly. He carried energy into a room like a bright light, and for a moment the house felt alive again in a way it hadn't for weeks. "Grandma, we were passing through," he said, stepping inside with two of his friends trailing behind him, all of them tall and hungry and loud in the way boys forget to soften themselves around older people. I smiled anyway. I always did. They spotted the cookies before I could even offer them. "Who sent these?" Orion asked, already reaching. "Your father," I said. That made him pause just long enough for me to notice, but the moment slipped away under laughter. Plates clinked, chairs scraped. One boy grabbed two at once, another teased him about leaving crumbs. It was ordinary. So ordinary that any unease I felt seemed almost foolish. I watched them eat, listened to their voices bounce off the walls, and for a while the world felt harmless again. They packed the rest into a napkin before heading out, promising to visit longer next time. Orion kissed my cheek as he left, quick and warm. "Happy New Year, Grandma," he said. "And drive safe," I replied, standing in the doorway long after their car disappeared down the street. The house returned to stillness, the way a pond settles after a stone drops, slowly, almost reluctantly. I cleared the plates, rinsed the cups, and left one cookie untouched on the counter. Something about it felt unfinished, like a conversation that had stopped mid-sentence. That night I slept lightly, not fearfully, just aware. Memories of Koilem's recent tone crept into my thoughts, the way he smiled when conversations edged too close to money or control. I reminded myself that suspicion without proof was just worry wearing a smarter coat. Morning came quietly. I brewed coffee and stood by the window watching the street wake up. My phone buzzed once, then again. I ignored it at first, yet assuming it was a New Year greeting sent to too many people at once. But the calls kept coming. Caleb's name filled my screen over and over, each attempt closer together than the last. I wiped my hands on a towel before finally answering, expecting another casual conversation dressed up as concern. His voice sounded light, almost rehearsed. "So, did you enjoy the cookies?" I smiled without thinking. "Your son and his friends took everything. They love cookies." Silence fell so heavily on the line that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. For a moment, I could hear nothing but his breathing. Then his voice changed. "Joanna, you gave who?" Before I could answer properly, the line went dead, and I stared at the phone, feeling something small and cold shift inside my chest, like a door I didn't remember opening had just quietly clicked shut. His voice rose slightly, cracking at the edges. For a moment, I thought the call had broken. I started to explain again, slower this time, but he cut the connection before I finished. No goodbye, no explanation, just a hollow tone where his voice had been. I stood still, staring at my reflection in the dark screen. People don't end calls like that unless something inside them is already running. At first, I told myself he was just worried. Orion had always been careless with food, and Calum had a habit of overreacting when he felt excluded from decisions. Still, the way his breathing changed before the line went dead stayed with me longer than it should have. The house felt different after that. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It pressed against my shoulders like a weight. I moved through my mornings slowly, folding laundry, wiping surfaces that didn't need cleaning, rearranging the same set of cups twice without noticing. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted back to the phone, expecting it to light up again with an apology or a joke to smooth over whatever had unsettled him. It didn't. Instead, the hours passed in a strange stillness that made small sounds louder. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of distant traffic. I tried to shake the unease by stepping outside for air. The sky looked bright, ordinary, untouched by whatever had just shifted between us. Around midday, I sat down with a cup of tea and finally allowed myself to think about the last few weeks clearly. Calum's tone during our conversations. See Seraphine's sudden silence whenever inheritance came up. The way they both watched me sometimes, like they were waiting for a door to open on its own. I pressed my fingers together to steady myself. Suspicion had no place in a family unless it had somewhere real to stand. The phone rang again, not Kylam this time. An unfamiliar number. I answered slowly, expecting a wrong call or another greeting. A woman's voice introduced herself calmly, professionally. She spoke my name with careful pronunciation, the way medical staff often do when they need to confirm identity before delivering difficult information. Mrs. Joanna, I'm calling from St. Andrew's Medical Center. Are you related to Orion? My throat tightened before I could answer. Yes, I'm his grandmother. There was a pause. Not long, but deliberate, like she was choosing words that wouldn't break before reaching me. He was brought in earlier today after collapsing. He's receiving urgent care. We're contacting immediate family. The room seemed to tilt slightly, though my feet didn't move. I gripped the edge of the table, listening as she spoke about symptoms, monitoring, and doctors working quickly. Her voice stayed calm, steady. The kind of calm that belongs to people trained to stand between chaos and the families who must hear about it. When did this happen? I asked, surprised at how steady my own voice sounded. This morning, she replied. My mind ran backward through the hours, through the call with Calum, through the way his voice had changed, through the unfinished sentence he never let me finish. Confusion turned slowly into something colder, heavier. Dread. As after I ended the call, I sat very still. Outside, the neighborhood moved normally, cars passing, a dog barking somewhere down the street. But inside my chest, everything felt suspended between one heartbeat and the next. I reached for my phone to call Seraphine, but before I could dial, another message appeared at the top of the screen. 3 missed calls from Calum, and 1 new voicemail waiting to be heard. By the time I arrived at St. Andrew's Medical Center, the waiting area had already filled with quiet movement. Parents standing too straight, nurses speaking in low tones, the air thick with questions no one wanted to ask out loud. I walked in slowly, holding my handbag close to my side, trying to keep my steps steady. Grief, I had learned long ago, often arrives before understanding. A nurse guided me toward a private seating area. Her eyes were kind but careful, the way people look when they know more than they are allowed to say yet. Are you Joanna? She asked gently. I nodded. She explained that several young men had been brought in earlier that morning. Orion and 2 of his friends, all showing similar symptoms. The doctors were working quickly, running tests, monitoring everything closely. No one used dramatic words. No one rushed. But the silence between each sentence felt like a door closing. "What happened?" I asked. "We're still determining that," she said. "Right now, the priority is stabilization." That answer might have comforted someone else. It didn't comfort me. I had lived long enough to recognize when uncertainty wasn't just medical, when it carried the shape of something deeper. I sat down, folding my hands together to stop them from trembling. Around me, other families began arriving. A woman across the room clutched her phone tightly, whispering prayers under her breath. A man paced slowly near the window, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Time stretched in uneven pieces. Doctors moved past us with quiet urgency. Every time a door opened, heads lifted, hope flickering and fading within seconds. Eventually, a physician approached us. He introduced himself calmly and explained that they were dealing with a cluster of cases that looked connected. He didn't speculate. He didn't assign blame. He simply repeated that they were investigating possible causes and waiting for toxicology and lab results. I appreciated that restraint more than comfort. "I don't want guesses," I told him, my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. "Just facts when you have them." He nodded, almost relieved. People began exchanging information in hushed conversations. Where the boys had been, what they had eaten, when they had last seemed normal. I listened quietly, replaying every moment from the day before in my mind. The laughter, the cookies on the table, Orion grabbing a handful before leaving. A nurse returned with water for us, and as I reached for the cup, I noticed two men standing near the reception desk. They weren't dressed like doctors or family members. Their posture was different, observant still. One of them spoke briefly with hospital staff before scanning the room. The realization settled slowly. This was no longer just a medical emergency. While hospitals don't involve outside authorities unless something unusual demands it. An hour later, one of the other parents, the mother of a boy who had been with Orion, stood up abruptly. Her voice shook, but it carried across the room with sharp clarity. "My son doesn't just collapse," she said to the doctor. "Something happened. Someone needs to look into this properly." Her husband nodded beside her, jaw tight. "We want this reported," he added. "We're not waiting for assumptions." The doctor responded carefully, explaining that certain cases required notification of public health officials and investigators when multiple patients arrived with unexplained symptoms. It wasn't about blame. It was procedure. Procedure. The word hung in the air like a warning. I felt a slow chill move through me. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Something had shifted from private worry into something larger, something that would not stay contained within our family. As the parents continued speaking with staff, one of the men near the reception desk stepped closer to us. He introduced himself quietly, his tone respectful but firm, asking simple questions about timelines, meals, and last contact. I answered honestly, carefully, without adding emotion to facts. The cookies, the visit, the call from Calum that morning. When the man thanked me and stepped away, I realized the room had changed. Conversations were no longer about recovery alone. They were about cause. Across the waiting area, the other parents gathered together, their expressions hardening from fear into determination. One of them said softly, but clearly enough for me to hear, "If this wasn't an accident, the police need to be involved." The men didn't introduce themselves as detectives right away. They sat down beside me in the waiting area first, speaking softly, like people who understood grief move slower than questions. One of them carried a small notebook but didn't open it immediately. He waited until I met his eyes. "Mrs. Joanna," he said gently, "we're trying to understand the boy's timeline yesterday. Nothing formal yet, just helping the doctors build a clearer picture." I nodded. I had already decided I wouldn't guess, wouldn't fill silence with emotion. Facts were steadier than fear. They asked where Orion had been before coming to my house, who he was with, what he had eaten. Their voices stayed calm, never rushing me, but the weight behind each question pressed against my chest like a slow tightening band. "What was the last shared meal?" the second detective asked. The words settled into the room heavier than anything said before. I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because saying it aloud felt like opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. "They had cookies here," I replied finally, "a box that arrived the day before." The first detective glanced at his partner briefly, then back at me. "Who brought them?" "My son-in-law," I said. "Calum." Even speaking his name felt different now, like it belonged to a stranger I was only beginning to recognize. The detectives didn't react visibly. They simply wrote something down, nodding slightly. "Did you eat any?" one asked. "No," I said quietly. "They finished them before I had the chance." The sentence echoed back at me in my own voice, sharper than it had sounded when I first told Calum. I remembered the way his breathing changed on the phone, the way he ended the call without waiting for me to finish. At the time, I had told myself it was worry, nothing more. Now I wasn't so sure. Around us, the waiting area hummed with low conversation. Parents leaned into one another, sharing fragments of memory, each piece of information adding weight to the air. The detectives continued asking gentle, careful questions, not accusing, not dramatic, just steady. When did the cookies arrive? Did anyone else handle the box? Was there any packaging left? Each question pulled me back into the moment I first held the box, the neat folds, the careful wrapping, or the silence that felt heavier than kindness should have. Something inside me shifted then, small but unmistakable, a feeling I didn't want to name yet. I kept my voice calm, answering only what I knew for certain. Years of living had taught me that panic makes stories messy, and messy stories leave room for doubt. One of the other parents joined our conversation briefly, confirming their son had eaten the cookies in the car after leaving my house. Their voice trembled, but their eyes stayed fixed on the detectives, like someone holding on to control with both hands. The first detective closed his notebook slowly. "We're going to need to look at the box," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "Anything that came with it, packaging, wrapping, whatever remains." For a moment, I said nothing. The request felt ordinary on the surface, yet it carried a quiet finality. Evidence. That word hung between us without being spoken. "I threw most of it away," I admitted softly, "but the kitchen bin should still have something." He nodded. "That's all right. We'll arrange to collect it." As they stood to leave, I noticed the way the waiting room had grown quieter. Conversations paused as they passed, eyes following them with a mixture of hope and fear. I sat back slowly, folding my hands in my lap. My thoughts moved toward Calum again. His repeated calls, the sudden panic in his voice, the unfinished question he never allowed me to answer. Something wasn't right, but I didn't say it aloud, not yet. A nurse approached me a few minutes later, her expression gentle but serious. "Mrs. Joanna," she said, "the officers asked if you'd be available later today. Oh, and they'd like to visit your home to collect the cookie box and any packaging connected to it." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that request settle into my chest like a stone. Because once evidence enters a house, it rarely leaves without changing everything inside it. Seraphine arrived at the hospital with her shoulders pulled tight and her voice already sharpened by certainty. She didn't ask many questions at first. She walked straight toward me, her heels clicking softly against the floor, eyes searching my face like she needed to measure how much I knew. "Mom," she said, lowering her voice, "they're saying it could be food contamination. Something random. These things happen." The words came too quickly, too neatly arranged. Not a daughter grasping for comfort, more like someone rehearsing an explanation before anyone had asked for one. I studied her quietly. Her hair was perfect, makeup untouched, but her eyes moved too fast, darting between the nurses, the doors, the families waiting nearby. She kept glancing toward the hallway as if expecting Kylam to appear behind her. "What did the doctors say to you?" I asked gently. "They're still running tests," she replied, "but it's probably nothing deliberate. Just bad luck." Bad luck. The phrase hung in the air between us, fragile and heavy at the same time. She didn't ask about Orion the way I expected, not in the slow, trembling way grief usually arrives. Instead, she kept circling back to explanations, to reasons why no one should panic, why everything might resolve itself once lab results came back. And I watched her carefully. Years ago, I learned that denial has a rhythm. Fast words, quick breaths, eyes that refuse to stay still. She spoke about contamination like it was a shield she was holding up against something she didn't want to face. Kylam finally appeared an hour later, moving through the waiting area with a strained urgency that felt almost theatrical. He hugged Seraphine tightly, holding her longer than necessary, whispering something I couldn't hear. When he looked at me, his expression flickered. Guilt or fear, I couldn't tell which. "I didn't know they would eat all of them," he muttered quietly, almost to himself. I didn't respond. I simply nodded once, keeping my face calm. Their conversation stayed low, but tension slipped through the cracks. Seraphine asked him questions too quickly. Where he got the recipe? Why he had insisted on sending something homemade instead of buying a gift? He answered carefully, choosing words like someone stepping across thin ice. It wasn't an argument. Not yet. But the space between them felt strained, like a thread pulled too tight. A pair of detectives approached again, their presence subtle but impossible to ignore. They spoke politely, explaining they were gathering voluntary statements from everyone connected to the boys' timeline. No accusations, no raised voices, just procedure. Seraphine answered first, repeating her theory about contamination, her tone firm enough that it sounded less like a possibility and more like a conclusion. Kylam nodded beside her, adding small details that felt rehearsed, but the detectives didn't challenge him openly. They wrote things down, asked for clarification, and then thanked them both for cooperating. Legal processes move quietly at the beginning. No one said that aloud, but I could feel it in the room, the slow tightening of something larger than family tension. When it was my turn again, I kept my answers simple. The cookies arrived. The boys ate them. Kylam called afterward. Nothing more. As the detective stepped away, I noticed Seraphine watching them leave, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "They're making this bigger than it is," she whispered to me. "We don't need police involved over something accidental." I didn't argue. I didn't agree either, because the waiting room had changed. Conversations were quieter now, heavier. One of the other parents sat with her head in her hands while a nurse spoke gently beside her. Across the room, when a doctor walked toward us with a folder tucked close to his chest, his expression carefully neutral. He spoke softly to the detectives first. They listened without interrupting, their posture shifting almost imperceptibly. Then he turned to us. "We've begun toxicology testing," he said. "It will take time, but we need to rule out specific causes before we move forward." Specific causes. The words echoed through me like a bell struck once and left ringing. Seraphine inhaled sharply, glancing toward Kylam as if waiting for reassurance he didn't offer. He stared at the floor, jaw tight, hands clasped together too firmly. I sat back slowly, folding my hands in my lap, because once toxicology begins, questions stop being gentle, and answers stop belonging only to the family. Waiting has a sound. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's the quiet hum of machines behind closed doors, the shuffle of shoes across polished floors, the way people stop speaking when a doctor walks by. That afternoon, time moved slowly enough for thoughts I had been avoiding to finally catch up with me. I sat near the window, watching rain gather in thin lines against the glass. Families around me whispered in soft circles, grief wrapped carefully in hope. But inside my chest, something heavier was settling. Not fear, exactly, awareness. Years ago, when my husband wrote the inheritance clause, he told me something I didn't fully understand at the time. Wealth reveals character long before it transfers ownership. Back then, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now, sitting in that hospital waiting room, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were beside me. Caleb had never argued openly with me. He preferred patience that felt like pressure. Every conversation about the estate came wrapped in respect, but beneath it, I sensed urgency. A man watching a clock no one else could see. I had refused him calmly each time, not because I wanted control, but because I believed readiness mattered more than desire. Across the room, Caleb stood speaking with a nurse, his shoulders slumped in a way that suggested exhaustion. He looked like the image of a grieving father, quiet, composed, attentive. Other families nodded toward him with sympathy. He accepted it easily, bowing his head at the right moments, pressing his hand over his mouth when doctors walked past. But I noticed small things others didn't. He checked his phone too often, not like someone waiting for updates, but like someone tracking something unseen. His eyes moved toward the detectives whenever they crossed the room, then away just as quickly. When Seraphine leaned against him, he held her, yet his gaze drifted over her shoulder instead of meeting mine. Grief has a rhythm. I have lived long enough to recognize it, and his rhythm felt off. I didn't say that aloud. I didn't accuse him or question him. Suspicion without proof is a dangerous thing, and I had no intention of becoming a woman ruled by whispers inside her own mind. Still, every memory from the last few weeks returned sharper than before. His sudden interest in timelines, the way he asked about my health, the softness that felt rehearsed. Seraphine stayed close to him, repeating her belief that everything would turn out to be an accident. She spoke about contamination again, about something random that no one could have predicted. Her voice carried more certainty than comfort, and I watched her cling to that idea like a lifeline. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. A doctor updated us briefly. Stable. Still critical. Waiting on results. Each word landed carefully, measured to avoid giving more than truth aloud. I folded my hands together to steady them, breathing slowly, reminding myself that facts arrive in their own time. Then the detectives returned. They approached quietly, their expressions unchanged, but something in their posture felt more focused than before. One of them greeted me by name and asked if we could step aside for a moment. I followed them to a small seating area near the corridor, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. "Mrs. Joanna," the first detective said gently. "Well, we're trying to understand more about the preparation of the cookies." My chest tightened slightly, though my face stayed calm. "Did Caleb make them himself?" he continued. "Or did someone else help?" The question hung between us, simple on the surface, heavy underneath. And for the first time since this began, I felt the quiet edge of something darker move through my thoughts, settling into place like a puzzle piece I hadn't wanted to find. The detectives didn't accuse anyone. They didn't raise their voices or change their tone. They simply asked questions that moved closer to the truth, one careful step at a time. "Did Caleb mention anyone helping him prepare the cookies?" one of them asked. I shook my head slowly. He only said they were handmade. The detective nodded, writing something down. There was no drama in his face, and only patience, the kind that waits for patterns to speak louder than people do. When he thanked me and stepped away, I noticed Seraphine watching us from across the room, her expression tight with quiet worry. It didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift. Another parent had begun speaking with investigators, their voice low but urgent. A nurse walked past holding a folder, pausing briefly to whisper something to one of the detectives. I saw the subtle exchange of looks, not panic, not certainty, just the silent agreement that the case had moved into a new direction. Seraphine approached me moments later. "What did they ask you?" she said, her voice softer than before. "Who made the cookies?" I replied. Her eyes flickered toward Kylam instinctively. He was standing near the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a voice too quiet for anyone to hear. When he noticed us watching, he ended the call quickly. The detectives returned soon after, asking to speak with both of them together. I stayed seated, watching from a distance as they moved toward a quieter corner of the waiting area. The conversation remained calm, but Seraphine's posture changed almost immediately. Shoulders stiffening, arms folding protectively across her chest. I couldn't hear every word, but one name carried across the room clearly enough to reach me. Varel. The sound of it felt foreign, unfamiliar, like a word spoken in a language I didn't know yet somehow understood. Seraphine's face drained of color. She looked at Kylam, searching his expression for denial he didn't offer quickly enough. "Who is that?" she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. Then he hesitated, only for a second. But the silence said more than any explanation could have. The fracture didn't happen loudly. It began as a small space opening between them, a shift in the way she stood beside him rather than against him. Years of marriage don't collapse in one moment. They loosen slowly, thread by thread. The detective spoke gently about timelines, messages sent late at night, phone records that placed Kylam somewhere unexpected, deliveries that didn't match his earlier statement. They didn't accuse him of anything outright. They simply laid out facts that required answers. Seraphine stepped back, shaking her head faintly as if trying to clear a thought she didn't want to accept. Her gaze moved from Kylam to the detectives and back again, was searching for a version of reality that felt safer than the one unfolding in front of her. Around us, the waiting room grew quieter. Other families sensed the shift even without knowing details. Conversations softened. Eyes turned away politely, giving space to attention that didn't belong to them but still filled the air. Legal processes move like water. Slow at first, then impossible to stop once the current strengthens. Investigators expanded their questions carefully, confirming where ingredients came from, who had access, when the cookies were prepared. Each answer tightened the timeline instead of loosening it. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, watching everything unfold without speaking. Suspicion settled deeper inside me, not loud or dramatic, just steady. A doctor entered the room then, speaking quietly with the detectives. And they listened without interrupting, their expressions growing more focused with each sentence. The doctor's voice carried just enough for a few words to reach us. Lab findings, not consistent with accidental contamination. Seraphine's breath caught sharply. Kylam looked down at the floor, jaw tightening. The detectives turned back toward us, their calm unchanged. But the air around them felt heavier now, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be undone, because the medical report had shifted the question from what happened to something far more dangerous. Was this done on purpose? Funerals are supposed to soften people. That's what I believed most of my life. But that morning, the air inside the chapel felt tight with something heavier than sorrow. Conversation stayed low, unfinished, moving through the room like quiet currents that never settled. People hugged without warmth, whispered without comfort. Grief had turned sharp. I sat near the front, hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the rustle of fabric and restrained breathing around me. Orion's photograph rested beside a simple arrangement of flowers, his smile frozen in a moment that felt too alive for the silence pressing down on us. The other parents arrived one by one, their faces carrying exhaustion that words could not touch. When they greeted me, their eyes lingered a second longer than usual, searching for something. Answers, perhaps, or reassurance that this tragedy would not disappear quietly. No one spoke loudly, but I could hear fragments drifting through the room. They said the tests found something. Police are involved now. Someone has to be responsible. Accountability had become the language of grief. Caleb stood near the entrance, dressed in dark clothes that made him look smaller than I remembered. He greeted guests with bowed shoulders and heavy sighs, holding people longer than necessary, wiping his eyes at careful intervals. Anyone watching from a distance would have believed he carried the deepest pain in the room, but I watched closely. Grief moves through the body naturally. Uneven breaths, distracted hands, eyes that drift toward memories no one else can see. What I saw in him felt different, measured, controlled, almost practiced. He cried loudly when people approached, but fell silent the moment their backs turned. He's scanning the room as if measuring reactions instead of mourning. Seraphine stayed close to him at first, but her posture had changed since the hospital. She no longer leaned into him fully. There was space between their shoulders now, small but impossible to ignore. I didn't confront him. I didn't speak to anyone about what I noticed. The older you grow, the more you understand that observation holds more power than accusation. I let my silence do the watching for me. After the service, a few of the other parents gathered near the back of the chapel, speaking with quiet urgency. One father's voice rose just enough to carry across the room. "We're not letting this fade into silence," he said. "Our children deserve answers." No one argued. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. People lingered in small groups. I was exchanging information carefully, the way families do when grief begins turning into resolve. I stood near the steps, holding my coat closed, watching as Caleb moved from person to person, nodding, apologizing, repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed. A car pulled into the lot slowly then. Unmarked, ordinary enough that most people didn't notice at first. Two figures stepped out, their movements calm and deliberate. They spoke briefly with a uniformed officer already waiting near the entrance, exchanging a folder that looked too official to belong to mourning. I felt the shift before anyone said a word. One of the detectives approached me quietly. His voice stayed respectful, careful not to draw attention. "Mrs. Joanna," he said, "I wanted you to be aware that investigators have obtained a warrant related to the preparation of the cookies." The words settled into my chest without surprise. A warrant meant the quiet phase was ending. Across the lot, Caleb noticed the officers too. His expression flickered, just for a second, before he lowered his head again, slipping back into the posture of a grieving father. Seraphine watched him closely, her eyes narrowing in a way that told me something inside her had begun to change. I remained still, hands clasped gently together, letting the moment pass through me without outward reaction, because grief had crossed into something else now. And once the law steps into a family story, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence. The shift didn't happen loudly, no shouting, no dramatic announcement. Then it arrived quietly. In the way detectives began standing closer together when they spoke, in the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. I learned about Varel's interview not through gossip, but through the careful language investigators use when they want you to understand without feeling pushed. She confirmed she helped prepare the cookies. One detective told me gently in a private corner of the hospital hallway. She says she believed it was a gift. She didn't understand the full intent. The words settled into me slowly. A second pair of hands. A second voice in something that had already taken too much from us. I nodded once, keeping my face calm. Inside, pieces of the past began rearranging themselves. Caleb's late-night calls, the way he avoided certain questions, the softness in his tone whenever he mentioned wanting to ease my burden. I had always believed patience would protect us. Now I wondered if patience had only given someone more time to plan. Seraphine learned about Varel differently. Not from me, not gently. She overheard two officers discussing timelines near the waiting area. The way she turned toward Kylam afterward told me everything. Her eyes weren't angry yet, just searching, like someone trying to hold on to a version of reality that no longer fit. "What didn't you tell me?" she whispered to him. He shook his head quickly, offering explanations that sounded thinner than before. I didn't step closer. I stayed where I was, watching the space between them widen by inches. Investigators moved quietly through the process, building their case piece by piece. They didn't rely on emotion. They gathered records, phone messages that traced conversations back weeks, financial statements that revealed pressure Kylam had hidden behind polite smiles, on purchases that aligned too precisely with preparation dates. Motive isn't something detectives announce dramatically. It emerges through patterns. And the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. I overheard fragments as officers spoke near the nurse's station, references to debts, business setbacks, accounts running thin. Each detail felt like a thread being pulled from a sweater I once believed was whole. Kylam had always presented himself as composed, successful, forward-thinking. Now the image began to unravel quietly, revealing urgency beneath the surface. Still, he held on to his role as grieving father with careful precision. When visitors approached, his shoulders lowered, his voice softened, and he leaned into their sympathy. But the moment he thought no one was watching, his gaze sharpened, calculating, restless. And I noticed everything, but I said nothing, because suspicion spoken too early becomes noise. Observation spoken at the right time becomes truth. Later that afternoon, the detectives returned to speak with him again. Their voices stayed calm, respectful, but the questions were more direct now. They mentioned timelines that didn't match, messages sent at hours he had claimed to be elsewhere, small details that forced him to adjust his story sentence by sentence. From across the room, I watched Seraphine's expression shift. Confusion gave way to something quieter. Realization creeping in slowly like a shadow moving across her face. The detectives didn't accuse him outright. They simply repeated his earlier statements back to him, laying them beside new information collected from Varel's interview and financial records. In each comparison felt like a mirror held up to a version of him he could no longer maintain. He spoke quickly, correcting himself, explaining that he had forgotten certain details under stress. But the more he spoke, the more the timeline seemed to fracture. One of the detectives closed his notebook slowly. "There are some inconsistencies we need to clarify," he said, his voice calm but firm. I felt the weight of that word, inconsistencies, settle into the room like a quiet verdict. Because once a story begins to contradict itself, it doesn't just weaken, it breaks. The room felt different that morning, though nothing about the hospital had changed. Same polished floors, same soft voices drifting through the halls. But the way people looked at Kylam had shifted, not openly, not cruelly. Just a subtle distance where sympathy used to sit. He stood near the window when the detectives approached him again. Their tone stayed calm, respectful, but there was a firmness beneath their words now, the kind that doesn't ask for comfort, only clarity. "We need to revisit a few details," one of them said. I watched from my seat, hands folded neatly in my lap, the way I had learned to sit through difficult moments without letting emotion show first. Seraphine stood beside him, her posture stiff, eyes moving between the detectives and her husband like she was trying to solve a puzzle that refused to stay still. They spoke quietly, but the silence in the room carried enough of their conversation to reach me. Phone records, purchase dates, messages that didn't match the timeline he had given earlier. Each question landed carefully, never accusatory, just precise. Kylam's voice changed as he answered. At first, he spoke slowly, choosing words with care. But as the detectives continued, his sentences grew faster, explanations shifting slightly each time they circled back to the same point. Details he had been certain about days earlier suddenly became unclear. Locations blurred, times moved, narratives don't fall apart loudly, they unravel thread by thread. Seraphine listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing slightly as she replayed his words in her mind. I could see it happening. The moment certainty begins to crack. She glanced at me once, briefly as if searching for reassurance I didn't offer. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for truth to reveal itself. The detectives laid out the inconsistencies calmly, and they didn't accuse him of anything outright. They simply placed facts beside statements and allowed the gaps to speak for themselves. Financial pressure, messages exchanged with Varel late into the night, ingredients obtained through channels he had never mentioned. The room felt heavier with every minute. I told you everything, Calum said finally, his voice tighter now. You're making it sound worse than it is. We're just asking for clarification, one detective replied. Clarification. The word sounded gentle, but it carried weight. I recognized the shift then. The investigation was no longer about gathering background information. It had moved into something firmer, something that didn't bend easily. Seraphine stepped slightly away from him, arms folding across her chest. When her expression wasn't anger yet, it was disbelief slowly turning into recognition. She had defended him so fiercely in the beginning, speaking about accidents and misunderstandings. Now she listened without speaking, her silence louder than any accusation. I watched my daughter's certainty crumble quietly. It didn't break all at once. It faded like a light dimming slowly in a room that used to feel safe. The detectives exchanged a brief look before closing their notebooks. Based on what we've gathered so far, one of them said, his voice steady, we're moving forward with the next phase of the investigation. He didn't say the words probable cause, but I felt them settle into the space between us. Kylam's jaw tightened. His eyes moved toward the exit briefly, then back to the detectives, as if measuring the distance between where he stood and where this was leading. Seraphine lowered her gaze, breathing slowly, absorbing something she could no longer deny. And for the first time since this began, I felt a quiet shift inside myself too. Not relief, not anger, just a steady understanding that truth had finally stepped into the room. As the detectives turned to leave, one of them paused near me. We may need you available later today, he said gently. Things are moving quickly. I nodded once, already knowing what he didn't say aloud, because when investigations reach this point, silence stops being uncertainty. It becomes preparation, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, an arrest was no longer a question. It was a matter of time. There was no shouting when they came for him. No flashing lights cutting through the morning. Just two vehicles pulling into the hospital parking lot with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to announce itself. I was sitting near the window when the detectives returned, their posture calm, their faces steady in that professional way that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Coylum stood as they approached, as if he had been expecting this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. Mr. Calum, one of them said softly, we need you to come with us. The words landed without drama. No raised voices, no sudden movement, just procedure unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Seraphine froze beside him, her fingers tightening around her bag. For a second she looked at me, not for help but for confirmation that this was real. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Do some moments demand stillness more than reaction? They explained his rights carefully, their tone respectful, almost gentle. He nodded once, jaw set, eyes drifting across the room like he was memorizing the space he was about to leave behind. A few people nearby turned their heads, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. No cameras waited outside, no reporters gathered. Whatever attention this would draw later, it began quietly, within walls that had already held too much grief. As they guided him toward the exit, He glanced back at Seraphine. She didn't follow. She stood rooted in place, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. Years of trust don't collapse loudly. They sink inward first, leaving silence where certainty used to live. Or the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than any slammed entrance. I released a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Legal processes move forward without spectacle. The detectives returned briefly to explain that charges were being filed based on evidence gathered, timelines, intent, and the harm that had already unfolded. They didn't speak about feelings or family arguments. They spoke about facts. That was how the system worked. Emotion might begin a story, but law builds its case on proof. Seraphine turned to me then, eyes searching. "You're not going to help him?" she asked quietly. I met her gaze calmly. "This isn't something I can fix," I said, "and it isn't something I should try to." The words didn't come from anger. They came from clarity. I had spent years protecting my daughter from consequences she wasn't ready to face. This time, protection meant stepping back. The waiting room felt smaller after he left, like a piece of tension had been removed, but the echo remained. Nurses moved through their routines. Families whispered softly. Life continued in that steady way it always does, even when someone else's world shifts beyond recognition. Hours later, one of the detectives approached Seraphine privately. I watched her listen, her shoulders stiffening slowly as he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I saw the exact moment her expression changed, the way her lips parted slightly, the way her hand moved to her chest as if she needed to steady her breathing. She looked at me afterward, eyes wide with something deeper than grief. "Mom," she whispered. They said the woman who helped him, Varel, wasn't just someone he knew." Her voice trembled, breaking on the name. "She was more than that." The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable, because betrayal had just revealed another layer, one that would change everything Seraphine believed she understood about her marriage. Seraphine didn't cry right away. She sat beside me in the hospital waiting area, hands clasped tightly together, staring at a point on the floor like she was trying to rearrange the past by looking at it long enough. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "They said he was seeing her for months," she whispered. "Not just business, not just help, months." I didn't rush to fill the silence. Some truths need space to land properly. Around us, nurses moved quietly between rooms, their footsteps steady, indifferent to the way a family can fracture without making a sound. She inhaled slowly, then spoke again, words coming faster now. I thought he was just pushing because of the estate," she said. "I knew he wanted access sooner. I knew he was frustrated. But this wasn't what I agreed to." Her eyes lifted to mine, searching for judgment that never came. The hardest part of being a mother isn't speaking wisdom. It's knowing when silence will teach more than words ever could. "I didn't know," she said again, almost pleading. "I believe you," I replied gently, and I did. There are kinds of guilt that belong to intention and kinds that belong to blindness. Seraphine's shoulders slumped as if something heavy had finally been set down, but relief didn't follow. Only realization. She spoke quietly about the last year, the pressure Koilim felt, the way conversations about money had crept into ordinary moments, the subtle urgency she had tried to ignore. She admitted she had asked me more than once to reconsider the inheritance clause, thinking she could stabilize things if she just had access. "I thought if we fixed the money, everything else would settle," she said. I listened without interruption. For the first time, I saw not the confident daughter who argued with me about independence, but a woman confronting the consequences of trusting someone else's desperation. "I never imagined he would go this far," she added softly. I reached over and placed my hand on hers, not tightly, just enough to remind her she wasn't alone. A desperation makes people smaller than they believe themselves to be, I said. But it doesn't make you responsible for what you didn't choose. She nodded faintly, though I could tell she wasn't ready to forgive herself yet. Inside me, something shifted then. Not anger, not sorrow. A quiet settling. For weeks I had moved through shock, through grief that blurred every thought. Now clarity arrived without noise. I stopped asking why and started seeing what was. Strategic calm doesn't feel powerful when it begins. It feels like still water after a storm. Smooth on the surface, deep underneath. The detectives returned briefly to update us that prosecutors were reviewing the evidence collected so far. Their tone remained careful, but I recognized the language of transition. The investigation moving toward formal charges, or toward a story shaped not by emotion but by law. Seraphine listened, her expression tightening as details surfaced. Timelines, intent, the role Varel played without understanding the full plan. Each piece stripped away another layer of denial. When the detectives stepped away, a woman in a dark suit approached us. She introduced herself as part of the prosecutor's office, her voice calm and precise. She explained that they were preparing the formal case theory, outlining how the evidence connected, how intent would be demonstrated, how the timelines supported their argument. I felt Seraphine's hand tremble slightly beside mine. The prosecutor spoke about facts, about patterns, about how the law would interpret what had happened. No dramatics, no moral speeches, just structure. The shape of accountability forming quietly in front of us. As she finished, she added one final sentence. In the coming days, you may hear more details presented publicly. We want you prepared for that. Prepared. I nodded once, understanding what she meant even without explanation, because the story was no longer just ours to carry, and soon the world would hear it told in a language that left no room for illusion. The courthouse felt colder than the hospital ever had, not because of temperature, but because everything inside it moved with purpose. Conversations were quieter, footsteps slower, eyes sharper. People didn't come there to comfort one another. They came to tell the truth in a language that left little room for emotion. I sat in the gallery with my hands folded in my lap, listening as the proceedings began. No one raised their voice. No one dramatized what had happened. The prosecutor spoke calmly, outlining facts that had taken weeks to gather. Timelines built from messages, purchases, and financial records that revealed a pattern of pressure long before the cookies were ever prepared. They didn't start with blame. They started with motive. The inheritance clause came up early, not as gossip, not as family tension, but as context, a structure that explained why access to the estate mattered so much. They described conversations where Quilem had asked repeatedly about timelines, about control, about what would happen if I were no longer present to decide. Hearing it laid out that way felt different from remembering it myself. Memory carries emotion. Court carries structure. Messages appeared on screens, dates, times, or fragments of words that once sounded harmless when spoken privately. Now they formed a pattern. Financial statements followed, showing debts that had grown quietly behind polite smiles. The narrative wasn't built from a confession. It was built from consistency. I glanced toward Seraphine sitting beside me. Her eyes stayed forward, unblinking, absorbing each piece of information as if it weighed more than the last. This wasn't the life she believed she had built. It was the one she was now forced to see clearly. Virel entered the room later, escorted quietly to her seat. She looked smaller than I imagined, not hardened, not defiant, just tired. When she spoke, her voice carried uncertainty more than guilt. She admitted helping prepare the cookies, believing it was a gesture meant to soften family tension. And she spoke about conversations with Quilem that sounded persuasive, not threatening. The court listened carefully, weighing involvement against intent. Legal language moved slowly. Structured charges, discussions of responsibility, conversations about possible plea agreements that might reflect her level of knowledge. Nothing felt rushed. Justice, I realized, often moves with deliberate patience. Across the room, Calum sat still, shoulders straight, eyes lowered. The image of a grieving father had faded. In its place sat a man surrounded by the quiet consequences of his own decisions. His attorney spoke when needed, challenging interpretations, requesting clarification, but the tone remained controlled. No theatrics, just law. As evidence continued, the story shifted from possibility to fact. The inheritance clause was no longer just a family matter. It had become part of a timeline that explained pressure, motive, and planning. Each detail added weight without needing exaggeration. I felt no triumph listening to it, only a steady calm that came from seeing truth stand on its own. During a brief recess, a court officer approached me with a gentle expression. "Mrs. Joanna," she said quietly, "the prosecution would like to request your testimony later in the proceedings." The words settled into my chest without surprise. I had known this moment would come. Seraphine turned toward me slowly, eyes searching. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," she whispered. "I will say what is true," I replied. She nodded faintly, understanding more than she said aloud. The courtroom doors opened again, calling us back inside. Conversations resumed, lawyers returning to their seats, the judge's voice steady as proceedings continued. I sat down, breathing slowly, preparing myself for the next phase. Because telling the truth in private is one thing. Speaking it aloud where every word becomes part of the record is something else entirely. I walked to the witness stand without rushing. The courtroom felt quieter than before, not because fewer people were present, but because attention had shifted. Every movement carried weight. Every word spoken from that chair would become part of something permanent. I rested my hand on the railing lightly before sitting, feeling the steadiness of the wood beneath my fingers. The prosecutor's voice stayed gentle as she began. "Mrs. Joanna, can you explain the estate clause that has been mentioned throughout these proceedings?" I nodded once. My voice did not tremble. Years of living had taught me that calm carries further than anger ever could. "My husband created the clause before he passed," I said. "He believed wealth should come with readiness, not urgency. The estate was never meant to be withheld out of punishment. It was meant to be released when responsibility had matured enough to carry it." No one interrupted. Even the small sounds of the courtroom, papers shifting, chairs moving, seemed to pause. I explained how the decision had always been mine to make, not out of control, but out of care. I spoke about conversations with Seraphine and Calum, the requests that came softly at first and then more often as time passed. I didn't accuse, I didn't exaggerate, and I simply described what had happened. "When you refused early access," the prosecutor asked gently, "what was your intention?" "To protect my daughter," I replied, "and to protect the legacy my husband built, not from her, but from decisions made before she was ready to carry their consequences." My words settled into the room without drama. I saw Seraphine watching me from her seat, her expression softer than I had seen in years. For the first time, she wasn't hearing me as a mother arguing for control. She was hearing me as a woman explaining responsibility. The defense attorney rose for questioning, his tone respectful but probing. He asked whether family disagreements might have been misinterpreted, whether financial pressure had been exaggerated by investigators. I answered each question calmly, refusing to let emotion guide my voice. "I never denied my daughter," I said. "I delayed access because I believed timing mattered. That belief never came from anger." There was no need to say more. Restraint carries its own authority. I didn't need to describe betrayal or grief in dramatic detail. The facts already spoke for themselves. When I stepped down from the stand, I felt something shift quietly inside me. Not relief, not triumph, just balance returning after weeks of uncertainty. Authority didn't come from confrontation. It came from standing steady long enough for truth to settle on its own. Seraphine reached for my hand as I passed her seat, her fingers tightening gently around mine. "I didn't understand before," she whispered. I didn't answer right away. Some realizations need silence more than reassurance. And I squeezed her hand once and continued walking, letting the moment remain unfinished. The judge announced a brief recess before the next phase. Lawyers gathered their notes, voices low, preparing for what came after testimony. Arguments, decisions, the slow movement toward final judgment. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter than before, though nothing about it had changed. I stood near the window, watching people move past, each carrying their own stories into rooms where truth would be measured carefully. One of the court officers approached me quietly. "They'll be moving into verdict discussions soon," she said. "Sentencing will follow if the ruling stands." Her words were gentle, but they carried the weight of finality. I nodded slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of my breath return. And because the story was no longer about what happened, it was about what would be decided next, and how consequences would settle into lives that could never return to what they were before. The courtroom felt quieter than it had any right to be when the decision finally came. No gasps, no raised voices, just the slow rise of everyone standing as the judge entered, the sound of chairs shifting like a tide pulling back from shore. I sat beside Seraphine, hands resting calmly in my lap, listening to words that had taken months to arrive. The verdict was delivered in measured language, deliberate actions, proven intent, consequences shaped not by emotion but by law, charges confirmed, sentencing outlined. The system did not shout. It closed around the truth with quiet certainty. Calum didn't look at me when the decision was read, and he kept his eyes forward, shoulders stiff, as if holding himself upright required more strength than anything else left in him. The room didn't react dramatically. People absorbed the outcome the way adults do when reality finally settles into place. Reputations don't collapse loudly. They fold inward, one conversation at a time. Outside the courtroom, no crowd waited, no cameras pressed forward. The story had never been about spectacle. It had been about consequence, private, heavy, and impossible to undo. Varel's situation was addressed separately, shaped by the court's understanding of her involvement. The legal language remained precise, reflecting degrees of responsibility rather than broad judgment. Watching it unfold reminded me that justice rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It feels structured, almost quiet. And Seraphine sat beside me without speaking, her gaze fixed on the floor. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Something in her had changed long before this day arrived. The certainty she once carried had been replaced by a steadier, humbler stillness. When the proceedings ended, people began leaving slowly, voices low. I rose carefully, feeling the weight of the past months settle into something steadier inside my chest. Not relief, not victory, just closure shaped by truth. Outside, the air felt warmer than I expected. Seraphine walked beside me without touching my arm, but she stayed close, not leaning, not hiding, simply present. "I thought everything would fix itself if we just waited long enough," she said quietly. "I didn't realize waiting doesn't change who someone is." I looked at her, seeing not the daughter who once pushed against me, but a woman standing in the aftermath of choices she never fully understood. "The estate remains exactly where it has always been," I told her gently. "Nothing about this changes that." She nodded slowly. There was no argument in her eyes this time, only acceptance, and the beginning of something that looked like growth. Days passed. Conversations around us softened into distance. Friends who once called frequently grew quiet, unsure how to speak about what had happened. The house felt different when I returned. Not emptier, just clearer. Every room carried memory, but none carried chaos. I moved through my routine slowly, watering the plants, opening windows to let sunlight settle into corners that had felt heavy for too long. And the estate papers remained locked exactly where they had always been. Nothing rushed, nothing changed out of guilt or pressure. Seraphine visited often, but her presence shifted too. She no longer spoke about access or timelines. She spoke about rebuilding, about learning to stand without leaning on promises that were never hers to claim. One evening, she asked quietly, "Do you think I'll ever be ready?" I didn't answer right away. Readiness isn't measured by words. It reveals itself through patience. "Time doesn't make someone worthy," I said finally. "Choices do." She nodded, absorbing the weight of that truth without resistance. As the sun lowered beyond the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, I felt something inside me settle into calm I hadn't known for months. Not pride, not satisfaction, or just steadiness, the kind that comes from surviving storms without letting them change who you are. People later asked me how I felt after everything ended. I never gave them the dramatic answer they expected, because I didn't celebrate. I simply drew one quiet line and held it steady. Inheritance isn't a reward for waiting. It's a responsibility you have to survive long enough to deserve.